May 19, 1945. The war in Europe had been over for exactly 11 days, but Paul Nitze wasn't celebrating. The 38-year-old investment banker turned government official was racing against time, flying in a C-47 transport aircraft toward Flensburg, a small port city on Germany's northern coast near the Danish border. His mission was urgent, specific, and potentially historic. He needed to find Albert Speer before anyone else did. Nitze peered through the aircraft's small window at the landscape below. Even from this altitude, the devastation was obvious. German cities lay in ruins, their industrial districts reduced to skeletal frameworks of twisted steel and crumbled brick. Rail yards sat silent, bridges collapsed into rivers, refineries stood as blackened husks. This was the work of the Allied strategic bombing campaign, the most sustained aerial assault in human history. More than 3 years of raids by British and American bombers had dropped millions of tons of explosives on the Third Reich's industrial heartland. But had it worked? That was the question driving Nitze's mission. As vice chairman of the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, he was tasked with answering perhaps the most important military question of the entire war. Did strategic bombing actually win wars? Could air power alone bring a modern industrial nation to its knees? The answers would shape military doctrine for decades, influence billions of dollars in defense spending, and potentially determine strategy in the ongoing war against Japan, where American planners were contemplating an invasion that could cost 1 million casualties. And there was only one man who could provide definitive answers: Albert Speer, Hitler's architect turned armaments minister, the man who had somehow kept Germany's war machine functioning even as Allied bombs rained down month after month, year after year. Speer had been at the center of the Nazi war economy from 1942 until the very end. He knew everything. The question was whether Nitze could reach him first, before the United Nations War Crimes Commission hauled him away to face justice for crimes that included working millions of slave laborers to death. The race was on, and Nitze knew that other intelligence agencies were hunting for Speer too. British teams were already in the area. Soviet representatives had arrived in Flensburg. Everyone wanted to interrogate the man who had orchestrated what many called the Armaments miracle, the seemingly impossible achievement of doubling German weapons production while cities burned and factories crumbled under the weight of Allied bombs. As Nitze's aircraft descended toward Flensburg, he reviewed what he knew about his quarry. Albert Speer was 40 years old, an architect by training who had caught Hitler's eye in the early 1930s with his dramatic designs for Nazi rallies and party buildings. Hitler had loved him, trusted him, treated him almost like a son. When Fritz Todt, the previous armaments minister, died in a plane crash in early 1942, Hitler had appointed Speer to replace him. It was a decision that would prolong the war by years. Speer had transformed German war production. He had rationalized the chaotic system of competing agencies and personal fiefdoms that characterized the Nazi bureaucracy. He had implemented mass production techniques, centralized control, and ruthlessly prioritized resources. The results were staggering. German aircraft production had tripled. Tank production had more than doubled. Artillery output had increased 5-fold, and all of this happened while American and British bombers were systematically destroying German industry. How had he done it? More importantly, what would have happened if the bombing campaign hadn't taken place at all? These were the questions that kept Nitze awake at night. The Strategic Bombing Survey had been established in November 1944 specifically to answer them. President Roosevelt himself had ordered the study, recognizing that the post-war world would need to understand the true effectiveness of this new form of warfare. The aircraft touched down on a damaged airfield outside Flensburg. Nitze gathered his briefcase and stepped out into the May sunshine. The city before him was a strange sight. Flensburg had survived the war relatively intact, its streets filled not with rubble but with German soldiers. Thousands upon thousands of them, packed so densely that civilians could barely move through the crowds. These were the remnants of the Wehrmacht, military forces that had retreated to this northern enclave in the war's final days. And somewhere in this chaos was the so-called Flensburg government, the last gasps of the Third Reich. After Hitler's suicide on April 30th, Grand Admiral Karl Donitz had declared himself the Führer's successor. He had gathered the remnants of Nazi leadership here in Flensburg in the buildings of the Murwick Naval School overlooking the fjord. For 3 weeks, this government in name only had pretended to still have authority, still have purpose, still have a nation to govern. But everyone knew it was theater, a strange interlude between the end of fighting and the complete dissolution of German sovereignty. The Allies had allowed this charade to continue, partly because they were still negotiating surrender terms for scattered German forces, partly because they hadn't yet figured out the logistics of occupation, and partly because intelligence agencies wanted access to Nazi officials before they disappeared into prisoner-of-war camps or worse. It was in this twilight period that Nitze hoped to conduct his interrogation. He made his way through the crowded streets to the naval school. British and American military police had established a perimeter, but inside, German officers still moved about with a bizarre semblance of normalcy. Ministers held meetings. Staff officers filed reports. It was as if they couldn't quite accept that everything was over. Nitze found what he was looking for at Glucksburg Castle, a white Renaissance structure about 4 miles from Flensburg proper. The castle had been commandeered as detention quarters for high-ranking Nazis awaiting final disposition. And there, in a modest room with a view of the surrounding countryside, was Albert Speer. Nitze's first impression was of a man utterly unlike the caricature of a Nazi official. Speer was tall and slender, with dark hair and an alert, intelligent face that occasionally broke into a sardonic smile. He looked more like a university professor than a war criminal. He wore no uniform, just ordinary civilian clothes that somehow made him seem even more out of place in this military setting. But it was Speer's demeanor that struck Nitze most powerfully. There was no blustering, no defiance, no protestations of innocence. Instead, Speer projected an air of calm cooperation, even eagerness to help. He greeted Nitze politely, offered him a seat, and made it clear that he was ready to answer questions, lots of questions, for as long as it took. Nitze understood immediately what was happening. Speer had already figured out his survival strategy. He had correctly guessed that other Nazi leaders would claim ignorance, blame others, or insist they were just following orders. So Speer would do the opposite. He would accept responsibility, cooperate fully, and position himself as the rational technocrat who had been horrified by the regime's excesses but powerless to stop them. It was a brilliant gambit, and Nitze could see it unfolding in real time. Joining Nitze for the interrogation were 2 other members of the Strategic Bombing Survey team, George Ball, a lawyer and economic analyst who would later serve as Undersecretary of State, and John Kenneth Galbraith, the brilliant young economist who would become one of the most famous public intellectuals. Together, these 3 Americans sat down with Albert Speer for what would become one of the most consequential conversations of the entire post-war period. They had 10 days, Nitze knew, maybe less. Already, word was spreading through Allied command that Speer needed to be officially arrested and transferred to proper custody. The United Nations War Crimes Commission was pressing for access. The Soviets were demanding that all senior Nazis be turned over for prosecution. The window of opportunity was closing fast. For the next week, from May 19th through May 29th, Nitze and his colleagues spent 5 hours a day with Speer. They questioned him about production figures, bombing damage, resource allocation, labor shortages, transportation bottlenecks, and 1,000 other details of the German war economy. Speer answered everything, providing numbers, anecdotes, and insights that no other source could offer. He directed them to hidden records, gave them combinations to safes containing crucial documents, and explained the inner workings of the Nazi industrial apparatus with remarkable candor. What Nitze began to discover in these sessions would fundamentally reshape his understanding of the war, of industrial power, and of America's place in the world. The revelations wouldn't just influence the Strategic Bombing Survey's conclusions. They would help create the strategic framework for the entire Cold War, shape American defense policy for generations, and reveal a truth about American industrial might that even Hitler's most catastrophic miscalculation had failed to capture. The interrogation was about to reveal something bigger than just the effectiveness of bombing. It was about to expose the true nature of 20th century warfare. That wars between industrial powers were won not on battlefields but in factories, not by generals but by workers, not through tactical brilliance but through sheer productive capacity. And in that contest, America possessed an advantage so overwhelming that it had effectively predetermined the war's outcome before the first shots were fired. The man who built Hitler's war machine. To understand why Paul Nitze considered Albert Speer's testimony so crucial, you need to understand what Speer had accomplished during his 3 years as armaments minister. It was nothing less than a transformation of German war production that military historians would spend decades trying to explain. At one point, Todt died in that mysterious plane crash on February 8, 1942. Germany's armaments production was in chaos. Multiple agencies competed for resources. Party officials and military commanders operated their own fiefdoms. Production was inefficient, uncoordinated, and far below what Germany's industrial capacity should have achieved. The country was fighting a massive war on multiple fronts, yet its economy still produced consumer goods. Factories operated on single shifts. Women were not mobilized for war work. The Nazi leadership seemed to believe their own propaganda about rapid victory, making total mobilization unnecessary. Hitler appointed Speer as Todt's replacement, a decision that surprised many in the Nazi hierarchy. Speer was only 36 years old. He had no experience running industrial enterprises. He was an architect, not an economist or military man. But Hitler trusted him completely. They had worked together for nearly a decade on grandiose building projects, including plans to rebuild Berlin as Germania, a monumental capital that would dwarf ancient Rome. At a 1.0 pace, what Hitler didn't anticipate was that Speer possessed an extraordinary talent for organization and a ruthless pragmatism about getting results. Within months of taking office, Speer began restructuring the entire German war economy. He created a central planning board that coordinated resource allocation across all industries. He established production committees led by industrialists rather than party bureaucrats, giving practical engineers authority over ideologues. He rationalized production methods, eliminating thousands of different weapon variants in favor of standardized models that could be mass-produced. The results were immediate and dramatic. In 1941, before Speer took control, Germany produced 5,200 tanks and self-propelled guns. In 1942, his first full year, production rose to 9,300. By 1944, despite the intensifying Allied bombing campaign, German factories produced 27,300 tanks. Aircraft production followed a similar trajectory. Germany accepted 11,770 aircraft in 1941. Under Speer's management, that number rose to 15,600 in 1942, then 25,220 in 1943, and finally 40,590 in 1944. These weren't just impressive numbers, they represented an existential achievement for Germany. Without Speer's production increases, the Wehrmacht would have collapsed in 1943 for lack of equipment. The Eastern Front alone was consuming thousands of tanks and aircraft every month. German forces were taking staggering losses, and only Speer's industrial mobilization kept them in the field. But here's what made Speer's achievement so remarkable and so relevant to Nitze's investigation. All of this production increase happened while Allied bombs were systematically destroying German industry. The first 1,000-bomber raid hit Cologne on May 30, 1942, just months after Speer took office. From that point forward, the bombing only intensified. Hamburg was firebombed in July 1943, creating a firestorm that killed 40,000 civilians. The Ruhr industrial region was pounded month after month throughout 1943. Berlin was hit by massive raids all through the winter of 1943-44. Yet German production kept rising. Even in 1944, as American daylight bombers joined British night raids in around-the-clock attacks, even as specific industrial sectors like ball bearings and aircraft factories became priority targets, Speer somehow kept the weapons flowing. How was this possible? This was the central mystery that the Strategic Bombing Survey needed to solve. Speer achieved his results through multiple strategies. First, he dispersed production. When a factory was bombed, he moved its machinery to other locations, often to underground facilities or to regions beyond the reach of Allied bombers. He created redundancy in the system so that the destruction of any single facility wouldn't cripple production of critical items. He simplified designs, making weapons that were easier and faster to manufacture. He ruthlessly prioritized the most essential military equipment over luxury items or less crucial weapon systems. And he exploited slave labor on a massive scale. This was the dark engine that powered Speer's armaments miracle. Millions of foreign workers, prisoners of war, concentration camp inmates, and forced laborers were driven to work in German factories under horrific conditions. They were starved, beaten, worked to death. They had no choice, no protection, no hope. Speer directly supervised this system. He visited concentration camps to arrange for prisoner labor. He knew exactly what conditions these people endured, and he considered it an acceptable price for increased production. The numbers are staggering and horrifying. By 1944, approximately 7.5 million foreign civilians were working in Germany, plus 2 million prisoners of war. They represented more than 20% of the German workforce. In some industries, particularly mining and construction, the percentage was much higher. These workers produced the weapons that prolonged the war, and hundreds of thousands of them died in the process. But even with slave labor and organizational genius, Speer was fighting a losing battle against Allied industrial power. By 1944, he was increasingly aware that Germany couldn't win. The numbers simply didn't add up. American production had reached levels that German planners found incomprehensible. Every German tank destroyed was replaced by 5 Allied tanks. Every aircraft shot down was replaced by 10 more. The Wehrmacht was like a man fighting an avalanche with a shovel. At a 1.0 pace led Speer to one of the most controversial acts of his career, his defiance of Hitler's Nero decree in March 1945. As Allied armies closed in from east and west, Hitler ordered a scorched earth policy. Everything of value was to be destroyed to deny it to the enemy. Factories, bridges, power plants, transportation networks, food stockpiles, all were to be blown up or burned. Germany would be left as a wasteland. Speer claimed he was horrified by this order and worked to sabotage its implementation. He countermanded destruction orders, convinced military commanders to ignore Hitler's directive, and preserved as much German infrastructure as possible. According to Speer's later accounts, this was when he finally broke with Hitler, when his loyalty shifted from the Führer to the German people and their future. Was this true, or was it a convenient post-war fabrication designed to make Speer look like a humanitarian? The evidence is mixed. Speer certainly did prevent some destruction, but his motives were complex. He may have been thinking about post-war reconstruction and Germany's future. He may have been positioning himself for survival after defeat. He may have genuinely been appalled by Hitler's nihilistic destructiveness. Probably all three were true to some degree. What's certain is that when Speer met with Hitler for the last time on April 23, 1945, in the Führer bunker beneath Berlin, their relationship was fundamentally changed. Hitler was preparing to die. Speer was preparing to survive. And survive he would, largely because of the strategy he deployed in those May 1945 conversations with Paul Nitze. Speer understood that he had enormous value to the Allies as an information source. He knew more about German war production than anyone else alive. He knew where the records were kept, what the real numbers were, which programs had succeeded, and which had failed. He also knew that other Nazi leaders would be uncooperative, belligerent, or simply ignorant of the details that interested Allied investigators. So Speer presented himself as the cooperative technocrat, the rational professional who regretted the regime's crimes but could provide invaluable information for historical understanding. It was a calculated gamble, and as Nitze began his interrogation, both men understood the stakes. For Speer, cooperation might mean the difference between execution and imprisonment, between being branded a major war criminal and being seen as a relatively minor figure who had tried to limit damage. For Nitze, Speer's testimony represented a unique opportunity to understand the true impact of strategic bombing on a modern industrial economy. Neither man could have anticipated how profoundly their conversations would shape the post-war world. The information Speer provided wouldn't just fill in historical details. It would reveal fundamental truths about industrial warfare that would influence American military planning for decades. And those revelations would force Nitze to confront an uncomfortable reality about American power that even he hadn't fully grasped. Paul Nitze, Wall Street to War Planning. At a 1.0 pace, Paul Henry Nitze arrived at that interrogation room in Flensburg as the product of privilege, education, and ambition, a thoroughly American story of how the establishment elite shaped 20th century policy. To understand why his encounter with Speer mattered so much and why the revelations about American production hit him so forcefully, you need to understand the man who conducted the interrogation. Born on January 16, 1907, in Amherst, Massachusetts, Nitze grew up in a world of comfort and intellectual stimulation. His father, William Albert Nitze, was a professor of Romance languages and literature, first at Amherst College and later at the University of Chicago. His mother, Anina Hilken Nitze, came from a wealthy family with deep German roots. Young Paul grew up surrounded by books, ideas, and the assumption that he would join America's educated elite. His childhood was marked by one formative experience that would shape his entire worldview. In the summer of 1914, the Nitze family was traveling in Europe when World War I erupted. 7-year-old Paul found himself in Munich as Germany mobilized for war. He witnessed the crowds in the streets, the patriotic fervor, the sudden transformation of a peaceful society into a war machine. The experience lodged deep in his mind. The fragility of peace, the speed with which catastrophe could arrive, the importance of being prepared for the unexpected. Nitze followed the expected path for someone of his class and intelligence. He attended the Hotchkiss School, an elite boarding school in Connecticut where the sons of wealthy families were groomed for leadership. From there, he went to Harvard, graduating in 1928 just as the American economy was about to collapse. But Nitze graduated into a fortunate position. Through family connections, he landed a job with Dillon Read & Company, one of Wall Street's most prestigious investment banking firms. The timing could have been disastrous. The stock market crashed in October 1929, just a year after Nitze started working. The Great Depression devastated the financial industry, ruining countless bankers and investors. But Nitze not only survived, he thrived. He had a talent for analyzing bonds and understanding industrial economics. More importantly, he had arrived at Dillon Read at exactly the right moment to catch the attention of James Forrestal, one of the firm's top executives. At a 1.0 pace, Forrestal became Nitze's mentor, patron, and gateway to power. 12 years older than Nitze, Forrestal was brilliant, intense, and driven by demons that would eventually lead to his suicide in 1949. But in the 1930s, he was a rising star, and he recognized in young Nitze a similar intelligence and work ethic.
The two men formed a partnership that would last until Forrestal's death and would bring Nitze into the highest circles of American power. By 1940, Nitze had achieved significant financial success. At 33, he was a vice president at Dillon Reed, married to Phyllis Pratt, an heiress to Standard Oil fortune. He could have spent his life making money and living comfortably, but that wasn't Nitze's temperament. He was restless, intellectually curious, and increasingly concerned about the deteriorating international situation. Europe was at war. Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany. America seemed unprepared for the conflict that Nitze believed was inevitable. Forrestal was called to Washington in 1940 to serve as a special assistant to President Roosevelt. He immediately reached out to Nitze. "Be in Washington on Monday," the telegram said. Nitze went. It was a decision that would define the rest of his life. He would spend the next 49 years in public service, advising 10 presidents, shaping defense policy, negotiating arms control agreements, and becoming one of the most influential figures in Cold War strategy. But in 1940, Nitze was just beginning his government career. His first assignments dealt with his area of expertise, economics and industrial production. He worked with the Office of the Coordinator of Inter-American Affairs, ensuring that Latin American resources flowed to the Allied war effort rather than to Germany. In 1942, he became chief of the Metals and Minerals branch of the Board of Economic Warfare, managing the global competition for raw materials essential to weapons production. These assignments taught Nitze crucial lessons about modern warfare. Victory didn't depend solely on strategy or tactics or even bravery. It depended on production capacity, on the ability to turn raw materials into finished weapons faster than your enemy could destroy them. Nitze learned to think in terms of industrial systems, resource flows, production bottlenecks. He understood that a war between industrial powers was fundamentally a contest of manufacturing capability. By 1944, Nitze had caught the attention of the leadership organizing the Strategic Bombing Survey. His analytical abilities, his understanding of industrial economics, and his reputation as someone who could get things done quickly made him an ideal candidate. When Franklin Dollier was appointed chairman of the USSBS in November 1944, he assembled a board that included some of America's brightest minds: lawyers, economists, industrialists, and academics. Nitze was named first as a director and then as vice chairman, making him one of the survey's most powerful figures. The Strategic Bombing Survey's mission was both simple and monumentally complex. It needed to determine whether strategic bombing worked. Did the massive investment in bombers, the thousands of aircraft lost, the tens of thousands of airmen killed, the millions of tons of bombs dropped, did all of that actually contribute to victory in a way that justified the cost? The question mattered for obvious military reasons. The United States had built its air war strategy around the idea that precision daylight bombing of industrial targets would cripple German war production. Britain had pursued a different strategy of nighttime area bombing, designed to destroy cities and break civilian morale. Both approaches had been enormously expensive in money, resources, and lives. If they hadn't worked, if Germany could have been defeated more effectively through different strategies, then military doctrine needed to change. But the question mattered for political reasons too. The war in Europe was ending, but the war against Japan continued. American planners were contemplating an invasion of the Japanese home islands that could result in millions of casualties on both sides. If strategic bombing could bring Japan to surrender without invasion, countless lives would be saved. But that required confidence that bombing actually worked, that it could break an enemy's will and capacity to fight. The survey was organized with impressive thoroughness. Teams of investigators followed close behind advancing Allied troops, interviewing German industrialists, examining bombed factories, studying production records, analyzing transportation networks. The goal was to understand not just what damage had been done, but how that damage had affected German war-making capability. Had bombing slowed production? By how much? Which targets had been most effective? which campaigns had been wastes of resources. But the investigation faced a fundamental problem. The Germans themselves had incomplete information. Records had been destroyed. Officials gave conflicting accounts. Factory managers exaggerated damage to explain production shortfalls or minimized it to look competent. Without a central figure who understood the entire system, the survey risked producing fragmentary, contradictory conclusions. That's why Albert Speer was so valuable. He had sat at the center of the German war economy for 3 years. He had received regular reports on bombing damage. He had personally visited destroyed facilities. He had struggled daily with the problems that bombing created: replacing destroyed machinery, rerouting transportation, relocating production, finding new sources of raw materials. No one else had his comprehensive knowledge. But Nitze knew he couldn't simply accept Speer's testimony at face value. The man was fighting for his life. Everything he said needed to be verified against documentary evidence and cross-checked with testimony from other sources. The interrogation would need to be methodical, comprehensive, and skeptical. As Nitze prepared for his sessions with Speer, he was operating with certain assumptions about what he would find. He expected to hear that bombing had been effective but not decisive. He anticipated learning that some campaigns had worked better than others. He assumed he would discover specific vulnerabilities in industrial systems that could guide future targeting decisions. At a 1.0x pace, what Nitze didn't expect was to emerge from those conversations with a fundamentally revised understanding of American power. He didn't anticipate that Speer would, through concrete details and specific numbers, reveal just how completely outmatched Germany had been from the beginning. And he certainly didn't foresee that these revelations would shape his thinking for the rest of his career, influencing everything from his role in drafting NSC 68 to his decades of work on nuclear strategy. The interrogation was about to become not just an investigation of German war production, but a revelation about American industrial supremacy that would echo through the rest of the 20th century. 7 days at Glicksburg Castle. The interrogation began on a surprisingly pleasant May morning, with sunshine streaming through the windows of the room where Speer had been held. Paul Nitze, John Kenneth Galbraith, and George Ball arranged themselves around a table with notebooks, documents, and lists of questions they had been preparing for weeks. Speer sat across from them, calm and attentive, ready to talk. At a 1.0 to 10 days, accounts vary on the exact duration, was one of the most remarkable intelligence-gathering sessions of the entire war. For 5 hours each day, sometimes extending into the evening, the Americans questioned Speer about every aspect of German war production. The sessions were intense, detailed, and remarkably cordial given the circumstances. At a 1.0x, Galbraith would later describe Speer's demeanor during these interrogations with characteristic insight. He noted that Speer seemed determined to distinguish himself from other Nazi leaders, to establish himself as the rational technocrat who had somehow remained sane in an insane regime. Speer projected an air of calm competence, even humor at times. He was unfailingly polite, extraordinarily cooperative, and seemingly eager to help the Americans understand what had really happened in the German war economy. The questioning began with the basics. Production figures. How many tanks had Germany actually produced each year? How many aircraft? How much ammunition? How many trucks? How many weapons of each type? Speer provided numbers, detailed numbers, numbers that could be verified against German records. He explained how production had increased under his management, what innovations had made that possible, where bottlenecks had constrained output. Then, Nitze and his colleagues moved to the heart of their investigation, the impact of Allied bombing. They walked Speer through specific campaigns, specific targets, specific time periods. What had happened when the Allies bombed the ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt? When they targeted aircraft plants around Leipzig? when they destroyed the synthetic oil refineries in the Ruhr. Speer's answers were nuanced and sometimes surprising. Yes, bombing had caused problems, serious problems in some cases, but Germany's industrial system had proven remarkably resilient. When one factory was destroyed, production was moved elsewhere. When transportation networks were disrupted, alternatives were found. When specific components became scarce, designs were modified to use different materials. The German war economy was like a living organism, constantly adapting to damage, constantly finding workarounds. But then Speer revealed something crucial. There was one campaign that had truly threatened to collapse the entire system: the attacks on oil production. Beginning in May 1944, Allied bombers had systematically targeted Germany's synthetic oil plants. Germany had no natural petroleum reserves. Everything depended on these synthetic fuel facilities, massive industrial complexes that used coal to produce gasoline, diesel, and aviation fuel. The bombing was devastating. By June 1944, according to Speer's testimony, aviation fuel production had dropped by 90%. Tank divisions couldn't move. Aircraft couldn't fly. Pilot training was severely curtailed. New jets sat on airfields without fuel to power them. The entire Wehrmacht was being strangled by lack of fuel, and there was nothing Speer could do about it. The oil plants couldn't be dispersed or hidden. They were massive, fixed installations that took years to build and were extremely vulnerable to bombing. Speer estimated that the fuel shortage became catastrophic by December 1944. When Germany launched its final offensive in the Ardennes that month, the Battle of the Bulge, the entire operation was predicated on capturing Allied fuel supplies. German tank units were told they would need to seize enemy gas to keep moving. When that didn't happen, entire panzer divisions were abandoned when they ran out of fuel. Nitze pressed for details. How much production capacity had been lost? How quickly could it be restored? What workarounds had been attempted? Speer walked them through the German response: emergency construction programs, repairs to damaged facilities, attempts to disperse production. None of it had worked. An army of 350,000 workers was assigned to rebuild the oil industry, but Allied bombers simply destroyed repairs as fast as they were completed. This was the revelation that Allied planners had been seeking. Strategic bombing had found Germany's Achilles heel. Not the ball-bearing industry, as some had predicted. Not aircraft production or transportation or steel mills. Oil. Everything depended on oil, and oil production could be decisively destroyed from the air. But Speer also revealed something else, something that the Americans found troubling. Many of the other bombing campaigns had been far less effective than claimed. The attacks on ball-bearing factories, for instance, had looked successful on paper. Schweinfurt had been bombed repeatedly at heavy cost to American bomber crews. German ball-bearing production had been disrupted, but the overall impact on weapons production had been minimal. Germany had managed to stockpile bearings, import them from neutral Sweden, redesign equipment to use fewer bearings, and generally work around the shortage. Similarly, the massive raids on German cities, the firebombing of Hamburg and Dresden, the destruction of residential areas, these had killed hundreds of thousands of civilians but hadn't significantly reduced war production. Factories could be repaired or relocated. Workers could be replaced, often with slave laborers who were treated as disposable. Civilian morale had deteriorated, but the Nazi police state prevented any organized resistance or collapse of will. At a 1.0, Galbraith asked Speer about the human cost. What about the slave laborers? Speer's response revealed his moral calculus. He acknowledged that conditions were terrible, that people died in large numbers, that the system was brutal. But he framed it as a necessary measure to maintain production. He claimed he had tried to improve conditions, argued that well-fed workers were more productive, pushed for better treatment. Whether this was true or self-serving revisionism would be debated for decades. The interrogation ranged over countless other topics. Nitze wanted to understand bottlenecks, the points where German production was most vulnerable. Speer identified transportation as critical. Once the Allies began systematically bombing rail yards and marshalling points, the entire system started to seize up. Coal couldn't reach power plants. Raw materials couldn't reach factories.